Welcome to Module 3 of the Game Like Training online motor learning course. I'm your host Matthew Cook, founder and CEO of Game Like Training. In the last module, we examined the different types of skill, the different types of feedback, and how a golfer utilizes each whilst hitting a shot. And I said a lot of words. I'm going to try and be more concise with this module, but if you've ever read Chaucer or Shakespeare, you know how difficult that can sometimes be for an Englishman like myself. So friends, golfers, golf coachmen and women, after all, this isn't the 1600s. Lend me your ears. I come to discuss acquiring, retaining, and transferring skills, the basic principles of practice, and I address the proper focus of attention, not muscle memory, because that doesn't exist. So, without further ado...
Wait, did you just paraphrase Shakespeare?
Yes, I did. Right, as I was trying to say, let's begin. So, starting things off, let's discuss the fundamental distinction between learning and performance. Research defines learning as improvement that comes with practice, that is relatively permanent, not temporary. Performance is what you can do, what you can observe, and what can be measured at any one time. Learning is when something is retained and can be transferred at a later date. So, when we talk about the acquisition of skill, the retaining of skill, and the transfer of skill, we're talking about learning. Golfers shouldn't necessarily see improvement in performance during a practice session, since performance isn't indicative of long-term learning. This feels backwards, doesn't it? Don't I usually stand over there before doing this?
Do what?
This. Golfers shouldn't see as much improvement as they think they'll see in their performance during a practice session or a golf lesson. It might be an improvement in performance, but typically from what they expect, it's not that much. If you have an appropriate practice session, then you're looking to get the level of difficulty and what we call the challenge point high enough to where it forces the student to struggle, maybe not complete some tasks, fail a little bit in practice, and just generally to make it a little harder for them so they can improve for the long term. So at times, depending on the level of golfer, because this applies to all, if you have a new beginning golfer, they need to see some sort of success because they need to be interested, and the same for young junior golfers. You know, kids that are 4, 5, 6 years old, it needs to be fun and they need to see some level of success. But don't get that success mixed up with always having to have an improvement in performance in a lesson, because as that golfer gets older or as the golfer gets better, the improvement in performance during a practice lesson is going to be significantly less as they get older and better. But there's someone who can answer this way better than I can because of their hands-on experience working at a golf academy every day with young golfers, older golfers, beginner golfers, experienced golfers, college level golfers, is Eric Zeigel at the AJ Golf Academy. So Eric, how do you approach this question? Because most cases, improvement in performance in a practice lesson or a golf lesson is usually there isn't any, is there? Yeah. But you've got to find the balance between them seeing some performance in order to keep them for the long term. So please go ahead and answer it how you would.
Great question. Something that, as an instructor, we see every day. Juniors, average club golfers, college players, professionals, whatever it is, whoever you're working with, they come with this expectation of leaving with this Band-Aid, right? So they come and they're not hitting it great, and they leave and it's just everything's great. They're good, they can go out, they're going to shoot 67 the next day. Not the case. So explaining in the beginning of the lesson, if we're going through a movement change, if we're working on something in the swing, we need to be in a learning mindset. We need to understand that performance will drop because we're changing something. It feels weird, it's uncomfortable. The club is now in a new place. The brain is having to figure out, okay, what is happening and how do I get this object? It was here, now it's here. How do I get this back to the ball? And I think once that's explained, it opens up kind of this opportunity for students to see more improvement. But if they're always trying to achieve this outcome, this level of performance, it pulls away from really them engaging in what they need to do to create that change. So, I like to turn it into a game with juniors, average players, whoever it is, where we'll actually grade the shot on a scale of 1 to 10 based on the practice swing or the drill. How closely did we achieve that desired movement in this shot compared to that? And if they're like, okay, that one was a 4, cool, why was it a 4 and how can we make it better? Well, I felt like I didn't do this as well as I did in the practice swing. Cool, so the goal of this shot, we're judging the success of this shot on if we can achieve X. And so once they kind of go through that and they start scaling it, they start to focus on, okay, I need to score better than a 4 by doing this in the movement. And a lot of times if they do that, the quality of the shot starts to improve. So performance can get better, but it's not until they start to disassociate those two that I oftentimes don't see that change in performance. So to answer your question bluntly, no, you won't always see the improvements that you're expecting, but yes, I think there is a level of improvement if the challenge point is correct for the student.
Welcome back. Now that I'm in the proper position, let's continue. When we refer to acquisition, we're talking about something we've improved that's relatively permanent. Retention is how permanent, how well we've retained it. And transfer is the ability to use what you've learned in a different environment, with new variables, new golf clubs, etc. The differences between performance and learning are really important when you are considering how to structure practice. We're sometimes fooled into thinking things that are producing performance are producing learning, but better performance in practice does not mean better long-term learning is happening.
That's it? Nothing snarky? No weak attempt at humor?
I told you, I'm being concise with this module. No need for cheap laughs. My goal is delivering knowledge, like a mailman for motor learning.
If by mailman you mean you look funny in shorts and never delivered on Sundays, I'd say that's pretty accurate.
Moving on. Next question, please.
The next question is, what are some good basic principles of practice?
Right. Some good basic...
If you knew that, maybe you would have been able to deliver on Sundays. Then you'd be like UPS for motor learning.
Funny. I practiced enough to be the one signing the checks though, right? Yeah, now I bet I earn your stamp of approval. Get it? Stamp. Like mailman. There, I gave you a little joke. Happy now? Good. As I was saying, some good basic principles of practice. A conversation I've had often with coaches, golfers, and parents, because they see some type of performance, good or bad, they encourage students, especially young ones, to continue or shy away from certain drills. I shouldn't have to tell you how harmful this can be. So, what are some good basic principles of practice? First and foremost, the power law. The more you practice, the better you are going to get. Now, this is relatively unimportant to most people.
Especially you.
The power law is relatively unimportant to most people because people have a limited amount of time to practice, which means it's even more important for practice to be effective and efficient. Effectiveness and efficiency are critical for people with limited practice time.
Okay, that's all good information to have, but I'm pretty sure people need something a bit more specific than just textbook technical jargon. Professor Cook.
Professor Cook. I like it.
What's in a name? That which we call a rose by any other name would smell as sweet.
I'm trying to teach people about golf and you're over there talking about flowers.
It's Shakespeare. Never mind. Forget it. Just give us some practice specifics, please.
Gladly. Anything to keep you from talking more about flowers makes me feel like I'm working with a redneck David Attenborough. Okay? Golf practice. So, variability practice. Variability practice is changing the parameters of practice using different clubs, different distances, etc. But it doesn't change how you structure variability into practice. Variability practice is similar to interleaved practice, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. Variability practice is doing different things all the time, and we're always doing something different. That's the whole reason behind variability. So, for example, a golfer that's on the range practicing, and let's say they're in a variability practice session, then they would need to change the club quite often, change it after every shot, or change it very frequently through that session. Some of the other things you could do is change the target. So rather than going to the yellow flag, they would choose to go to the red flag after, or the blue flag, or whatever targets you have on the range. The simple fact is that you should change all the time or more often. And then the other thing that golfers can do is change the goal. So let's say you've got a golfer and they're using their 7-iron, and they want to keep using that 7-iron for a while. That's fine, but make sure they're changing targets all the time. And let's throw another example in there. If they've got the 7-iron and they want to go to the same target, then they have to change something else. Otherwise, it's not variability practice. It sneaks into the realm of block practice, which we'll talk about in a little while. But the goal has to change. So were they hitting a standard stock 7-iron before? Because this time they're not allowed to hit that. They've got to hit a lower one or a higher one, or shape it left to right or right to left. Whatever it is doesn't really matter so long as it's different. That way, we always have the opportunity and the chance to make everything different, which is variability practice. Another form of practice is blocked practice. Blocked practice repeats the same parameters over and over. Therefore, block practice results in better performance due to temporary changes that aren't retained or transferred well over time.
Is that where the term blockhead comes from?
I feel like you would be the expert on that.
Block practice is where we have one task and we complete that task in succession regardless of the number of repetitions. It is basically us taking the same golf club and aiming at the same target and hitting a basket or a bucket of golf balls. That's the typical and usual way you would see somebody in block practice when it comes to golf. Usually this person would choose their favorite golf club and they would choose their favorite target out on the range, and they would proceed to hit 25, 50, 75, 100 golf balls, one after another, very little time between the golf balls, and no time between thinking of different goals or any sort of variability. The same thing over and over again. That is block practice.
You know what? I'm not going to do that after each one. Let's just wait until I've covered all the types of practice, then we can cut away to that supermodel we hired to reiterate the important parts. So, I've told you why block practice could be potentially beneficial to players just starting out. Now I'll explain the benefits of interleaved practice. Interleaved practice is varying the types of shots and forces players to do things differently. Interleaved practice is beneficial because it is more similar to situations that you may be faced with on the golf course, so it's more likely you'll be able to adapt to those variables. In other words, the situations and training presented in interleaved practice are more game-like.
Wait, so you made a whole speech about waiting until the end to cut away when you only had one more example.
Did I lie though? Like I said.
Interleaved practice is where we take two or more tasks and we complete them but never in succession. So if we take, for example, a task that involves a pitch shot and another task that involves a putt, a pitch and a putt, and let's say the total number of repetitions or learning trials, as we like to call them, is 25. That's a total of 50, 25 with each. How we would complete that in an interleaving way is we would execute one learning trial with the putt, and then we would move to the pitch, we would execute and complete one trial with that, and then we would go back to the putt. So you would end up doing 25 total with each, but you do them never in succession. This helps us in a lot of ways. It helps us induce learning. It helps us learn on a deeper level. It makes our brains think a little bit more, because what we have to do when we go to the next task is, if we did it previously, we have to try to cast our mind and our memory back and think about, what did that feel like? How did I do that? What were the things that made me successful last time? Or what things didn't make me successful? And how am I going to change to now be successful with it? So it forces us to think and try to remember. That is interleaving practice.
Moving along. Next question.
What?
Actually, why don't you just keep your mouth shut and think about everything you've done today? I can handle this one myself. I'm the captain. Captain Cook, if you will.
I won't.
Coaches often ask me what is a good way to understand the differences in blocked and variable practice, particularly with golfers at different levels. Now, I think I covered this earlier, but I'll hit on it again just to be sure. If it worked on my wife, it can work here. The course of true love never did run true.
Shakespeare?
To thine own self be true, and it must follow. Anyway, back to the task at hand. There is some room for block practice for beginners who struggle to get the ball airborne, off the tee, etc. Varying practice makes no sense if you are struggling with fundamentals. Once some degree of success has been established, it's time to start varying practice. Usually, there's only a very brief period of block practice needed before moving on. There is really zero need for block practice for golfers with any level of demonstrable skill. You know what's coming.
So blocked practice, variability practice, and interleaving practice, they all serve a purpose and they all have a place when it comes to practicing and when it comes to us coaches trying to help our golfers practice with better strategies. So there is a place, and it's never block practice versus variability practice versus interleave practice. We have to, and you have to learn to use them all to your advantage, and you have to look at these strategies and figure out, when is it the best time to use this one, when is it the best time to use that one, and when is the best time to use a little bit of each one. It all depends on the golfer and at what level they're at, so you can optimize the environment for them. So they all have a place. Typically, block practice serves a better purpose for newer or beginning golfers, or for those golfers that might be established but are learning a completely new skill. Then what is rather optimum is moving to more of an interleaving practice or a variability type practice to make the challenge point a little higher, make things a little bit more difficult in practice, which forces the golfer to think. If we think of it this way, if the golfers aren't thinking in practice, then they're not learning. So we use variability and interleaving to force golfers to think. And then once you're working with even more established golfers, some of the elite players, high professional athletes, then there is really no reason why they should be in a blocked type fashion of practice. They should be in more of an interleaving practice circuit where you can actually now start to focus on different areas. Variability practice, you can do a lot of different things all at the same time. But with interleaving practice, you can pick out, for example, a golfer's short game or a golfer's short game from 60 yards to 100 yards, as well as putting between 15 to 25 yards, whatever it might be. But interleaving practice gives you the opportunity to direct practice that is more varied, but in a specific way to target a specific weakness for that golfer. So you can really look at the low-hanging fruit and build really good practice programs and build really good practice tasks and circuits designed to target those very specific areas. So once again, they all serve a purpose. Block practice, variability practice, interleaving practice. Us coaches and you golfers are very aware and in tune with your players' games or your own games. You have to learn to use these strategies, all of them, to your advantage.
Another element that can sometimes be confusing is repetition without repetition. This is encouraged by varying the goal of shots. It may look the same, but with a different goal, it forces golfers to go through the process differently. Forget the turn, just roll it.
Repetition without repetition. Sometimes it's difficult to understand that concept. I got it from a book called Motor Learning and Performance, and I was also told this by Dr. Richard Schmidt himself as well as Dr. Timothy D. Lee. And they taught me about repetition without repetition, and it really encaptures the interleaving practice framework. So if you take the internal mechanisms that we talked about previously, the internal process that we go through from identifying the stimulus, responding to it, the motor program, etc., etc. If you forgot about that, go back and listen to it or watch it. But if we think of that internal process, that is the same regardless of the golf shot. So it's repetition of that internal process that we're trying to replicate, not necessarily repetition of the things externally that we see. For example, using the 7-iron. For an elite level golfer, taking a 7-iron with the same target and beating 50 golf balls in a row, not that type of repetition. So repetition without repetition is using or trying to engage the internal process, and sometimes it might not look like golfers are doing this on the surface level, but internally they might be. So we can never just assume by looking down the range that, oh, that golfer's didn't block practice, I've seen them play before, that's terrible practice. You know, I've done that before, and I'm sure many others have, and it's wrong. We shouldn't do that, because that golfer might be internally going through the process. They might just have a different goal in mind. So this golfer might be using a 7-iron, going to the same target, but has a different goal. They might be trying to hit it lower, medium height, a draw, or they simply might just be trying to visualize the ball going and flying a different way. Whatever it might be, there is something different which we can't see on the surface level. So repetition without repetition is focusing on the internal process, identifying the stimulus, responding to it, selecting an appropriate motor program, and letting it play out. Internally, that's repetition. Sometimes we can't see it on the surface level. We've got to watch out for it.
You're just going to sit there all day? Are you going to feed me a question?
I thought you had it handled, oh Captain, my Captain.
I like that. Not Shakespeare or even English, is it? But I like it. But seriously, question please.
Fine. Understanding the previous principles and concepts, when it comes to a golfer planning to structure practice, how can we look at these basic principles but also manage time to rest?
Maybe you should answer, since we're talking about rest. You are the expert. But this is actually a really good question, and one I get a lot. Golfers becoming burned out and disinterested is a very real issue. Luckily, it's an issue that's pretty easy to avoid, since there are lots of off-range and off-course things golfers can do while still improving their game. Often overlooked mental practice. It's the idea of visualizing the course or the swing, mentally rehearsing. Observational learning, usually done in a live environment, but there's no reason it can't be recorded, is learning from watching and analyzing. Lastly, when utilizing observational learning in a group format, golf coaches should encourage students to problem solve for an individual. This opens the door for the coach to provide feedback constructively and encourages problem-solving skills in the students. Only after students have tried to figure out issues for themselves should coaches provide feedback.
So is this when I provide my feedback about this course?
Be not afraid of greatness. Some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them.
What? Is this more Shakespeare or something?
Mental practice is probably one of the most underutilized practice things to do ever. And I remember watching a really cool series of DVDs on Tiger Woods, and Tiger Woods mentioned that he did this regularly. He would, in his home or somewhere else at the golf course or wherever it was, he would take a few minutes, sit down, close his eyes, and he would visualize things. He would try to bring about images in his mind of him, whether it was him winning tournaments, whether it was of a certain swing change or whatever it might be that he was working on or that was in line with his development at the time. He would just sit down, close his eyes, and imagine it. And I think it's one of the most underutilized things ever. Just because a golfer isn't at the driving range or isn't on the golf course doesn't mean they can't practice, and it doesn't mean that they can't do good practice. So mental practice is simply using your own mind in a quiet space or somewhere other than the golf facility. Another thing that we haven't really utilized is observational learning. And this is not reinventing the wheel. We've known this, whether we've known it outright or subconsciously. We learn better in most cases when we're in a group setting. And I know people are still traditional in their ways. They want the private lesson. They want to see the coach one-on-one. And there is a time for that, and it is important, but it's also important, if not more important, to spend time training and practicing with your coach, but in a group setting. Because what you find is that from watching your coach with another player or a group of players, you pick up things that you wouldn't have picked up maybe directly before. You spot things that some things you take to, some things you don't, but either way, you see from taking a step back other things. You're more perceptive to the overall environment, and then you might pick up things yourself rather than a coach telling you directly, this is an issue, this is what we need to work on. Rather, you get to sit back, you get to take a step back, you get to look at the overall environment, and you get to decide yourself, you know what? That was a really good tip that he gave, such and such. I'm going to try that. And just the act of you seeing it, and then it being in your mind and you thinking about it, and then you on your own accord going away and trying to do it yourself, whether it works or it fails is kind of irrelevant. The fact that you went through the mental process of all of that is what's going to make you better. So observational learning, very, very powerful tool. Another concept that is widely underused is this idea of giving an explanation, a demonstration, and then having a golfer go through whatever it is that you've just explained and demonstrated. I was once taught this, and many of us were, and it's only seemed logical throughout the years that that's what you do. You give a student an explanation of something, you then demonstrate how it's done, and then you watch them do it, and you give them corrective feedback on that particular thing. And it turns out that this isn't the most efficient or the most effective way to help our golfers learn. Rather, what we should do is place the golfer and the student in the environment to begin with, whether it's a test, a skills challenge, a game, whatever it might be that you're working on with them. Put them in that environment to begin with very minimal instructions. If there's rules to the game, they'll have to understand that. But if it's a particular shot they're trying to learn, like a high lofted pitch shot, don't give them all the information. In fact, give them nothing and see if they can figure it out. And then what you're going to find is they're going to fail. So just by your intuitive skill set, look at them in this environment, and if the difficulty is too high, you'll see it, so you can make adjustments there and then. If the difficulty is too low, you can make adjustments there and then as well. And what you'll find is that golfer is going to struggle through the tasks, and then after some time, bring them out of that environment, and then give them a little opportunity to give you feedback on it. And at that point, that is your opportunity to give the explanation, to relay the information. But now there's more context to it because you just saw what they struggled with. So maybe a few of the points that you would have originally said may be completely irrelevant because they already do it without thinking. So there's no point to bring that up. Don't fix what's not broken. We all know that. So at that point, give them the information that you think is necessary based off of the context of the whole environment, the whole challenge or the task that you've set. And then what you can do is go further and demonstrate some of those things that they may have missed. At this point, the students are so susceptible to the information because they've just struggled with it. It's like being given a test, like a math test or an English test, whatever test in school. It's like being given the test before you've had any learning on it, before you've gone to school for a semester. It's like they give you the test and you've got these questions and multiple choice answers and you have no idea what they are because you haven't learned it yet. So you look at these questions, you try to figure out logically, all right, it can't be this, it's got to be this. And it's all a guessing game. But after that, when you go through the information, because of what you've just been tested on, you are more susceptible to the information because you've been thinking about it a lot. The level of cognitive engagement is extremely high. And that's the whole thing with golf practice. We're trying to have our golfers think. If there's no thinking, there's no learning. So that is what we've typically been taught: explanation, demonstration, and then let the student go. Flip it around, try it that way. Put them in an environment, let them fail to a certain degree, bring them out of it, then give the explanation, then give the demonstration. It's a underutilized tool and technique, and it's highly efficient for better learning.
You can go to the GLT Golf YouTube channel and you can see myself and the coaches at the academy give live lessons, both with private lessons and group lessons with adults and juniors, and you can really see these concepts play out in real life, in real time. So be sure to go over there and check that out. It's pretty cool. So that about sums up the GLT Online Motor Learning Courses module, covering acquiring, retaining, and transferring skills, the basic principles of practice, and the proper focus of attention. Join us in Module 4 as we wrap up the instructional portion of our course. Until then, I must say good night. Good night. Parting is such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night.
Cut!